It started with the sound of boots crunching on gravel just beyond the porch steps. Early morning mist, still hanging low in the pines, my coffee half sipped, and the sunrise barely spilling gold through the mountain trees when they came. 3 of them, all in matching reflective vests with HOA compliance, stitched across their chests like it meant something. One of them was Karen, the self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association, whose reach had been tightening around the UT cabins in this once quiet lakeside community for months. She marched up the steps of my private retreat like she had a badge, waving papers and barking about unauthorized construction, occupancy limits, and some obscure violation involving non-conforming guest arrangements. I hadn't even opened my mouth before she turned and barked at her 2 sidekicks. "We need to enter. This structure is in known compliance and subject to administrative seizure." I laughed, assuming it was some delusional bluff. But when she motioned to one of the men, he actually pulled a bolt cutter from his backpack and headed toward my front door.
Oh.
That was when I realized this wasn't a warning, it was a raid.
No.
And if you think that sounds insane, just wait until you hear who was inside my cabin that morning, because what Karen didn't know, and what would change everything, was that my guest wasn't just any friend. He was someone who had every legal, federal, and tactical reason to stop her cold. But before we get to that, I want you to hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear is not just an outrageous story about HOA overreach. It's a full-blown showdown that started with a cabin door being broken and ended with federal agents rewriting Karen's entire life in handcuffs. Back to the door. It splintered with one loud crack, echoing through the trees like a gunshot, pieces flying into the air as I stood frozen in disbelief. They didn't wait for permission, didn't pause for a warrant. They walked right into my property, into my living space, shouting orders and acting like they had authority. Karen was filming it all on her phone, muttering things like evidence and record of resistance. I stepped forward, demanding they stop, telling them they had no legal right, that this was a private property not governed by their fake police cosplay. But Karen was emboldened. She shoved a sheet of paper in my face, some poorly formatted HOA citation with highlighted lines that had no real legal bearing. Then she ordered me to sit down and wait for the sheriff, claiming I was harboring an illegal guest. My stomach sank. Not because I was guilty of anything, but because I knew who was sleeping in the guest room just down the hall. Someone who valued silence and anonymity more than anyone I'd ever met. Circus had kicked the hornet's nest. My guest, who had arrived late the night before and gone to sleep without saying much more than keep my name off the books, was now being dragged into a war he hadn't asked for. I barely got a word in before the guest room door creaked open. There he stood. 6'2", calm, wearing plain clothes but carrying himself like the room belonged to him. Didn't shout, didn't threaten. He just stepped forward, holding out a single piece of identification that made Karen go completely silent in the middle of her tirade. It was a federal badge reel, laminated and shining with authority. "This property is not in violation," he said flatly. "And you have just committed unlawful entry under color of authority. You need to leave. Now." Karen's mouth opened, but no words came. Her camera was still recording, shaking slightly. One of the men behind her slowly lowered his bolt cutters. "I don't think you understand who I am," she finally said, voice quivering between rage and fear. "No," the agent replied. "I don't think you understand what you've just done." What followed in the next 15 minutes would start a chain reaction that not only exposed the corruption in our HOA, but also revealed that Karen had been abusing her position for years, issuing fake citations, intimidating homeowners even, authorizing surveillance on cabins without legal authority. She tried to talk her way out of it, of course. But my guest had already made the call to real law enforcement, not the toy badge squad she ran with. And as backup started arriving, this time actual sheriff's deputies, Karen found herself on the other end of the power dynamic for the first time in her life. But this was just the beginning. What came next involved secret records, falsified documents, and a hidden agenda that Karen never expected would come to light. Her breaking down my cabin door was bold. Wait until you hear what she tried after the deputies left. After the sheriff's deputies showed up and took over the scene, Karen tried her best to spin the narrative in her favor, claiming that she was only enforcing neighborhood standards and that she had reason to believe I was harboring a fugitive or running an illegal short-term rental operation, which was a total fabrication. The deputies didn't buy it for a second. They questioned her about the bolt cutters, the lack of a legal warrant, and the physical damage to my cabin door. She stammered through excuses, referring again and again to the same crumpled HOA printout she'd been waving around since the raid began. But when my guest calmly handed over a printed copy of the actual county property rights, highlighting the fact that HOA jurisdiction stopped at the main road and did not apply to private structures built prior to their incorporation date, the deputies grew cold toward her. "So you kicked in a door on a property you don't even have authority over?" one of them asked, visibly unimpressed. Karen's eyes darted around, searching for backup from her two sidekicks, but both of them had stepped far away and were pretending they had nothing to do with it. One even handed his bolt cutters to a deputy voluntarily and said, "She told us it was okay." That moment was the first time I saw something crack in Karen. She wasn't used to being questioned. She wasn't used to being alone, but the damage was done, and she knew it. My guest, who still hadn't given his name, publicly explained that he was staying with me on personal time and had already informed federal authorities of his location as part of routine protocol. He didn't raise his voice or make a spectacle, simply gave the deputies a few facts that made it clear they were in dangerous territory. If they sided with Karen, one of the deputies quietly stepped aside to make a radio call, and within 30 minutes, a county investigator was on site taking statements. Karen was asked to leave the premises until the matter was resolved. She didn't go quietly. She shouted threats about legal action, promised the HOA board would come down on me, and said something absurd about bringing this all the way to the mayor. But as she stomped away, she didn't notice the agent photographing the bolt cutter marks on my door frame or collecting the footage from my motion-detecting porch cam. She didn't see the deputy quietly asking my guest if he would be willing to testify should charges be pursued. And she certainly didn't see the email notification that had just arrived in my inbox. An auto-forward from the cabin's security system that had been triggered when her crew entered my property, complete with clear facial recognition logs, and a time-stamped video feed. That night, the cabin was eerily quiet. My guest sat at the dining table with a laptop, fingers moving fast as he typed a detailed incident report. I asked him what he thought would happen next, and he simply said, "She'll panic. People like her always do." But now she's not just facing HOA complaints, she's looking at state-level charges, possibly federal interference violations, if she keeps pushing. Sure enough, the next day, I received an email from the HOA board claiming I was under formal review for non-compliance and aggressive behavior toward community representatives. The irony nearly made me choke on my coffee. Karen wasn't done. She was doubling down. She was trying to bury the incident beneath paperwork, hoping to make it look like I was the one who broke rules while she simply enforced them. But what she didn't realize was that my guest had already forwarded every shred of evidence to the state's attorney general's office, as well as filed an internal report through federal channels documenting the incident. Karen had officially picked a fight with the wrong guest. The following week was a whirlwind of meetings, letters, and veiled threats. I was summoned to a closed-door session with the HOA board, during which Karen, still acting like she hadn't committed a crime, made a speech about how my dangerous associate posed a threat to the tranquility of the community. Over a printed copy of my guest's redacted clearance letter, and calmly stated on the record that if they continued harassing me or entering my property without consent, I would pursue charges. The board was clearly shaken. Some of them knew what Karen had done. One or two avoided eye contact entirely. That meeting, things got worse for her. The county investigator sent me a copy of their findings: unlawful entry, property damage, impersonation of an enforcement officer, and a potential conspiracy to intimidate a resident through unauthorized HOA action. Karen was served a cease and desist order at her home. Her two accomplices were notified that they might be called as witnesses. But even then, she wasn't done. She submitted an anonymous complaint to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, alleging that I was harboring suspicious individuals in a residential area. The complaint backfired when it got routed to the same federal office. Where my guest worked, he received it himself during a scheduled briefing and recognized the writing style immediately. Now, with her fingerprints all over multiple official documents, Karen had escalated from harassment to fraud. And still, she wouldn't stop. The pressure only seemed to make her more desperate. She began circulating flyers accusing me of running a black ops operation out of my cabin. She held a community awareness meeting in her driveway and showed altered screenshots of my guest's LinkedIn profile, trying to convince neighbors that we were endangering their children. But her lies were starting to collapse under their own weight. Several neighbors came to me privately apologizing for ever supporting her. One of them gave me a voice recording of her threatening to fine him if he didn't show up at her meeting. Another handed over one of her flyers and said, "This is insane. She's going to get herself arrested." She already had, she just didn't know it yet. Because while she was busy spreading lies and shouting at shadows, the county DA had quietly issued a formal indictment for property damage, harassment, and unlawful impersonation. Karen was about to be served again. This time it wouldn't be a warning, it would be the beginning of the end. But what she did next, stunt she pulled when the deputies came to her house, took everything to another level. When the deputies finally arrived at Karen's home with the warrant for her arrest, they didn't expect resistance, let alone the spectacle that unfolded on her front lawn. The sun had barely crested the trees when they knocked on her door, announcing themselves calmly, paperwork in hand, prepared for a standard arrest. But instead of answering like any rational person would, Karen bolted out of her back door wearing a bathrobe, clutching a stack of binders labeled HOA incident. Reports in ran across the yard screaming that she was being silenced by government operatives. Her next-door neighbor, a retired teacher named June, filmed the entire thing from her window, capturing Karen as she sprinted barefoot through the dew-soaked grass, yelling about her rights, shadow governments, and federal infiltration of small-town America. The deputies calmly followed her down the side of her house and gently restrained her without incident. But not before she attempted to toss the binders into a nearby trash bin while yelling, "They're coming for the truth." It was bizarre, surreal, and embarrassing, but also telling. Karen had come completely unhinged. She was placed in the back of the squad car, still raving about conspiracies, and transported to the county jail, where she was booked on multiple charges: unlawful entry, impersonating a public officer, criminal harassment, destruction of property, and obstruction of justice. Fallout hit the HOA like a bomb. The board called an emergency meeting to distance themselves from Karen's actions, stripping her of any remaining authority, access to documents, or communication with residents on official platforms. Several residents demanded an external audit of the HOA's finances and decisions made during her tenure. The local news picked up the story after June posted her video, and suddenly Karen's wild accusations were on TV, prompting even more community members to speak out. One man revealed Karen had fined him for building a tool shed in his backyard, then later asked for a personal donation to waive the fine. Another couple showed texts from Karen threatening to report them for excessive plant growth, unless they removed their non-native succulents. As all these stories emerged, so did the deeper truth. Karen had been using the HOA as her own personal power base for years, manipulating rules, collecting favors, and terrorizing anyone who dared challenge her self-made authority. Meanwhile, my guest had returned to DC for a formal debrief, but kept me in the loop with regular updates. He confirmed that the forwarded HUD complaint Karen submitted under a fake name had not only been traced back to her IP address, but was being added to her case file as further evidence of willful interference and false reporting. Neighborhood things finally began to settle. My door had been repaired, courtesy of a restitution order from the court. The two men who assisted Karen in the initial break-in had turned state's evidence in exchange for dropped charges, and both gave full written testimonies detailing Karen's manipulation and explicit instructions to create enough disruption to call in the sheriff. The court proceedings were swift, thanks to the mountain of evidence, camera footage, emails, witness statements, and the HUD complaint all tied directly to her. She pled not guilty at first, but her lawyer couldn't defend the volume of proof stacked against her. Eventually, she agreed to a plea deal: months probation, community service, mandatory counseling, and a permanent ban from serving on any HOA board or community leadership committee. But even then, the damage she had done lingered. I kept getting calls from local reporters asking if I wanted to go on the record. I declined. I hadn't done any of this for attention. I just wanted to be left alone in my cabin to live peacefully, without power-hungry neighbors turning a weekend retreat into a surveillance zone. But it was too late. Karen's story had gone viral. Clips of her backyard escape were circulating on TikTok. Memes of her screaming about deep state cabins made their way into Facebook groups. Someone even made a t-shirt with the phrase, HOA Truth Warrior, next to a cartoon of her tossing binders into a fire. The public embarrassment seemed to be the one punishment that truly impacted her. She moved out of the neighborhood 2 weeks after sentencing, quietly packing up her car and leaving before sunrise. A few residents reported seeing her drive past the lake one last time, staring blankly out the window. No words, no apologies, just silence. The HOA board restructured, bringing in an independent mediator and setting up new checks and balances to prevent future abuse of power. As for me, I went back to grilling on my deck and chopping firewood, finally able to relax. Again. My guest returned a few months later and we sat by the fire as he told me about a new assignment that would take him overseas. He said my case was still used as an example in training seminars, how local overreach could escalate into federal incidents if left unchecked. You know, he said, poking at the fire with a stick, you were patient through all of this. Most people would have cracked under her games. I laughed. It's because I had backup. Most people don't. He nodded and held up his bottle. To good neighbors, he said, and to knowing when to call in reinforcements. We clinked bottles and watched the flames crackle. But as peaceful as that night was, neither of us knew that Karen had left. Behind one last surprise, a legal counterclaim that would bring us both back into court and reveal secrets even I didn't know were buried in that cabin's history. It wasn't more than 3 weeks after Karen left town that I received a thick envelope by certified mail bearing the name of a civil litigation firm from a neighboring county. At first, I thought it was more paperwork regarding the restitution, order or maybe final documents from the HOA's internal restructuring process. But as I opened it and skimmed the dense legal wording, I realized it was something else entirely. Karen somehow had filed a civil counterclaim alleging defamation, loss of livelihood, and intentional psychological damage through coordinated social humiliation. The packet was padded with copies of memes, clips of her backyard arrest, circulating on the internet, and even statements from former HOA allies who had since turned their backs on her. She was accusing me and, by association, my guest of orchestrating a public smear campaign to destroy her reputation, and that the entire federal involvement had been manufactured to ruin her credibility. My first instinct was to laugh. But the letter came with a hearing date and court seal. She was serious. She'd actually managed to find a lawyer who would put her delusion on paper and walk it into a courthouse. My guest, now back in DC and deep into another assignment, wasn't surprised when I called. People like her rarely quit, he said. She's probably hoping to get some sympathy settlement or publicity from it. Don't worry, we're going to bury this thing before it even gets traction. What she hadn't counted on was how much of her own previous case had already become public record. Her criminal charges, her plea agreement, her HOA abuses all admissible and easily accessed. But it still meant I had to suit up and return to court. The courtroom this time was quieter, smaller, less dramatic. Karen sat across from me. No longer in HOA attire or clipboard-ready smugness, but instead in a gray blazer 2 sizes too large and makeup caked beneath her eyes as if to draw sympathy. Her lawyer, a smug, clean-shaven man in his early 40s, argued that I had unfairly provoked and recorded Karen, causing her emotional distress and creating an internet firestorm that had irreparably damaged her quality of life. My attorney calmly countered by walking the court through the timeline of events, beginning with her unlawful entry, destruction of private property, and the false HUD report, then topping it off with the federal badge reveal and her attempted backyard escape. The judge barely let the opposing side breathe. You're trying to allege that a person whose own criminal actions triggered media coverage is a victim of the response? He asked flatly. You cannot set your house on fire and then sue the neighbors for calling it in. But just when it seemed the case would be dismissed instantly, Karen pulled out her last card, a stack of old HOA files she claimed had never been reviewed by the court in her original trial. In them were surveillance notes, incident logs, and printed emails supposedly showing that I had been stockpiling suspicious equipment, consorting with unknown visitors, and deliberately provoking HOA officers through passive resistance and digital intimidation. I stared at the judge as he flipped through the files, waiting for his reaction. It came quickly. These are handwritten reports with no timestamps, no corroborating signatures, and were created after your arrest, he said. Do you expect the court to accept this as legitimate evidence? Her lawyer tried to pivot, but the judge cut him off. This isn't just baseless, it borders on contempt. He didn't dismiss the case immediately. Instead, he ordered a 24-hour continuance and requested copies of all original HOA board meeting minutes from the last year of Karen's leadership. That night, I got a call from one of the new HOA members, who told me they had gone through the archived drives and found something interesting, an audio file, dated 2 days before Karen's raid on my cabin, in which she was caught saying to another board member, he thinks just because he has some federal friends staying over, he's untouchable. Well, we'll see how untouchable he feels when we kick in that door and show everyone who really runs this neighborhood. It was game over. The next morning, my lawyer played the audio for the court. Karen froze in her seat. Her attorney slumped back and stopped taking notes. The judge's expression turned cold as he tapped his pen against the bench. This isn't just about property lines or personality clashes, he said. This is about abuse of position and personal vendettas disguised as governance. Ms. Palmer, not only is your claim dismissed with prejudice, you are also hereby referred for review regarding potential perjury and contempt. She didn't say a word, didn't look at anyone. The judge slammed the gavel, and it was done. The courtroom emptied slowly, and I walked out feeling not victorious, but vindicated. Karen had tried everything for us, lies, legal tricks, and failed at every turn. System had worked, but only because we'd stood firm and documented every step. The next few weeks were quiet. Karen's civil case was closed, her name removed from any public leadership roles in the county, and she, quietly relocated out of state, rumors said, to live with a cousin in a small desert town where no HOA would dare let her near a policy document. The cabin returned to its peaceful state, morning coffee on the porch, birds chirping in the pines, no more surveillance, no more fake notices taped to my mailbox. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this story, insane as it had been, wasn't just about Karen. It was about power and how far someone would go when no one holds them accountable. That night, I wrote down everything that had happened, not just to remember it, but to share it. People needed to know that these suburban tyrants don't just disappear quietly, they fight, lie, and sometimes even break the law to protect the illusion of control. But the truth, it always wins. And Karen, she'd learned that the hard way. But if you think this was the end, just wait, because what happened after I posted my story online brought even more chaos my way. After everything, after the court cases, the cease and desist, the civil countersuit, and Karen's public meltdown, life at the cabin finally felt like it was returning to normal. The air was cleaner, the nights were quieter, and the only thing knocking at my door was the wind pushing through the pines. But peace doesn't last long when the internet gets a taste of drama. Shortly after, I posted the full story online, detailing the months of harassment, the HOA break-in, and the federal fallout. The post went viral. It started as a Reddit thread, exploded on TikTok, and was soon picked up by a handful of commentary channels who ran with titles like HOA Karen Gets, Destroyed by FBI Agent, and The Cabin That Brought Down a Neighborhood Tyrant. My inbox overflowed. Messages from across the country poured in, people thanking me for sharing, others telling their own HOA horror stories, a few even asking for legal advice or help confronting their own neighborhood tyrants. I wasn't expecting it. I certainly hadn't planned on becoming the face of HOA resistance. But the more I read, the more I realized how common this was, how many small-time power-hungry people were terrorizing communities under the flimsy excuse of neighborhood enforcement. And what started as a simple story turned into something bigger. A reporter from a national investigative podcast reached out asking for a long-form interview. I agreed, carefully leaving out names and classified details but walking her through every step from Karen's clipboard antics to her final court defeat. The episode aired 2 weeks later and shot up the charts. Karen's story was out there now, not just as an embarrassing viral clip, but as a case study in local abuse of power. And with that attention came even more exposure. A few HOA board members from other counties came forward, revealing that Karen had previously served under a different name in advisory committees in other communities. One woman even shared archived emails of Karen threatening legal action over a sandbox that violated lawn symmetry. She had been at this for years, moving from neighborhood to neighborhood, playing enforcer until someone stood up to her. Now, with her track record exposed, those communities had a path to challenge her policies and nullify her old sanctions. I had unintentionally lit a fire that was now spreading across homeowners' forums, community groups, and city council inboxes. But not all the attention was good. I started noticing strange cars parked near the cabin again, unfamiliar faces, walking dogs that didn't bark. Then came the email from a throwaway account warning me to stop spreading lies and that I'd regret dragging innocent people into your drama. My guest who had been following all of this from afar flew back in for a weekend, just to check in. He ran the license plates from the strange vehicles. Turns out they were registered to a private property rights lobbying group based in another state, one that had ties to certain HOA legal defense funds. Karen had friends, he said quietly, and some of them don't want you turning this into a movement. We tightened security, updated the cameras, updated motion-activated lights all around the perimeter. And even though the visits stopped eventually, it was a chilling reminder that when you expose control, it rattles more than just the person in charge, shakes the whole system. But I didn't back down. I continued sharing resources. I helped 3 other cabin owners get their unjust fines waived. I gave interviews to small community publications that had long ignored their residents' complaints. I even started drafting a short guide titled Know Your Rights, Surviving HOA Abuse that I plan to release for free online. Karen may have broken my door, but she accidentally opened one too, a door to truth, accountability, and resistance against the manufactured authority that too many suffer under in silence. The cabin, once just a quiet place to unwind, had become the starting point of something louder, something that spoke for every homeowner who'd been bullied into submission. My guest, before leaving again, handed me a parting gift, a custom-engraved plaque that read "Private Property. You don't knock twice." I hung it above the door. She'd shattered. It still creaks when the wind blows hard, a reminder of the day a clipboard warrior thought she could play police and found herself face-to-face with justice instead. And while Karen may be gone, her story remains a warning to every overreaching HOA, to every neighbor with a fake badge, every bully hiding behind a rulebook. Sometimes the cabin fights back. If this story reminded you of your own battle with unfair power or gave you a reason to stand tall in your neighborhood, then don't let it end. Here, subscribe to Sham Stories right now for more shocking, true life tales where justice hits back harder than anyone expected. Because sometimes, the quiet ones, they're the ones ready to roar.